Who or what did Jacob wrestle with? Don't die, Spencer. You had trouble there. I did? What did I have trouble with? Okay, Mike Lehman. Who or what did Jacob wrestle with? I know enough Hebrew to know the word angel is not used. You are right about that. So the word ish, meaning man, is used. And then Jacob himself uses the word Elohim. Um, and I believe that the being, let's call him for now, also says, your name shall now be Israel, for you have wrestled, sarit, you have wrestled with God and with men, and you have not. You have not been, you have triumphed, you have come out, you've triumphed, is what he says. So those are the two sort of relevant words that appear in the Hebrew text. Elohim, which is a generic word for God, as opposed to the name of God, which is Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, right? So you don't get the name of God in this particular text. You do get Elohim, which is like, you shall have no other gods before me. So Elohim is a word that both applies to God, but also is often used of other kind of supernatural entities, or even of idols, or sometimes called false gods or Elohim. So you get Elohim and you get Ish, which is a man. So Jacob wrestles with a man, is the kind of most directly textual answer to that question. But the other question is the man also God? And first of all, when I revisited the um, when I revisited the text in sort of thinking about this question, it occurred to me that, we've talked a lot together in these live streams about the nature of how to read certain episodes in the Bible. Do we read them literally? Do we understand them as kind of literary stories? And is there a way to do both? And this is an example of a supernatural occurrence that I'm like pretty convinced just happened exactly as described. It has the First of all, it's written not as a poem or as a kind of allegory, but as an actual historical event. It takes place within the course of historical narrative, but also it just has the ring of truth to me. I mean, it's something that is so perfectly ambiguous while also being utterly pregnant with meaning, that it kind of, to me, corresponds to the experiences that I have had of encountering the spirit, right? When you feel like there's something really urgent being told to me here, but it's almost beyond, just at the side of my vision. It's sort of beyond the capacity of my mind to fully grapple with. And that's kind of what Jacob wrestling with the angels is like. There are some obvious interpretations, but it's also so much, it resists really neat kind of categorization. Um, and so, to put my cards on the table, I think that you're dealing here with a theophany, which is to say, God the Father never is kind of fully visible to man without destroying him. That's something he says to Moses. But part of the point of the second person of the Trinity is that he can be embodied. He can, and this also occurs with three people who visit. It's actually a very similar episode to the three people who visit Abraham in his tent, right? It's never really quite said who they are. Are they angels? Are they God? Are they whatever? But to me, they're, and this is, I didn't invent this. They're the Old Testament Trinity, right? They're a kind of physical embodiment. And these are people who have encountered Abraham, like real flesh and blood people, but they also embody the Godhead. And I sort of take the man with whom Jacob wrestles to be that, because he has the authority, for one thing, to rename Jacob Israel, which is something that only God could do, or a direct messenger of God. So, in many ways, angels and prophets, too, are kind of lesser emanations or embodiments of God, in that they encapsulate some aspect of God or some message of God in human language and space and time and speech. And that's kind of, angel, the word malach in Hebrew and angelos in Greek, angel just means messenger. And the function of these people, be they, and Navi, the prophet, is also one who pronounces. So the function of these people, be they human or supernatural, is to serve as kind of mini or proto or lesser incarnations. And then there are these episodes where it almost seems like the second person of the Trinity is here. There's elsewhere in these conversations, there's some debate and discussion about the distinction between the Son and Jesus, or the second person of the Trinity and Jesus. And to me, Jesus refers to a specific life of a person who lived and died on earth, um, and um, and is an incarnation, a complete incarnation of the second person. It is entirely God. And also, the second person has action and existence in the world before the life of Jesus ever comes to be. And so, although God, because God lives outside of time, like Jesus and the second person are one, and yet you can make a distinction, at least a cognitive distinction between them by saying, the second person does stuff that does not, at least visibly, manifest itself in the person, the human person of Jesus. This may be one of the things that the second person of the Trinity does. I think is it manifests himself as this man, and the ambiguity, the kind of evasive ambiguity of "I will name you Israel, for you have wrestled with God and man," right? And it might be that you've wrestled with God and man here in one and the same person, right? That this is an experience in which you've done both. I have a question about names in the chat, and I want to tell you a funny story. I was just chatting with Jeremy Boring, the God King of the Daily Wire, and he and I were talking about the names of God. We were having a conversation about some of this stuff. And I was remembering that when I was a little kid, the first time, or not a little kid, I was 14 or so, the first time I ever read the Bible, um, before I read the original languages, before I knew Hebrew or Greek, I was saying to my dad rather, like, he's saying, "Well, what are your impressions of reading the Bible?" I was like, it's really fascinating and rich and inspiring, but there's this funny thing where there'll always be these stories, and there'll be like a mom who has a baby, and she'll say something like, God has heard my prayer, and therefore I name you Shmuel. And I would be like, Shmuel? What are you doing naming him Shmuel? Like, what does that have to do with anything? And when these things get completely lost in translation, because all of those names have incredibly profound significance and are often just descriptions of what happened. So Isaac is a classic example, right? Isaac's mother laughs when she's told that she'll have this baby, which in Hebrew is Yitzchak, and so Yitzchak rather, yeah. And so she names him laughter, basically. She names him, I laughed, and all the names that have Yah at the end of them. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, right? That Yah is God. So usually you have something. Ishaya means like the salvation of God, or God is salvation. Daniel is El is God, so the judgment of God, the discernment of God. And so yeah, names are all incredibly profound and important, and even things like Isaiah names his children these incredibly bizarre strings of Hebrew words that are meant to kind of signify what is coming, and something like I'm going to get this wrong, but it's like Mahar Shalal Hazbash, which means like Baz, yeah, Hashbaz or something, which is like slow to plunder, sprint at prey, right? So these are all incredibly pregnant. Israel is, like I said, it comes from the Hebrew word for wrestling, sarit. You have wrestled with, and then El is God. So you have wrestled with God, basically, is the name that he gets and that Israel then gets. And that's, of course, very significant because Israel does wrestle, is in a constant wrestling match with God, right? That's kind of what they do.